virtual gathering for the purpose of continuing our reading and listening to the words recorded in the Bible. I'm Pastor Lou Kilgore, serving as minister, pastor of the High Mountain Presbyterian Church here located in Franklin Lakes. And this is, I think, the fifth installment online of this style of teaching and reading related to the Bible. Our history together before the pandemic and before we went to virtual was that we are a Wednesday morning group that would get together and read, discuss, and try to make our way through trying to carry in one basket the story of the Bible, if you will, or its stories, and to be able to have a sense that since it's proclaimed as being an important book or an important resource in living faith, that we would actually read it, that would actually know what it says, and then figure out what to do, especially with the difficult parts. So we've arrived now in our reading through. We did skip the later chapters of Job, otherwise we have read pretty much all of it to get to the Psalms. And so today, in this week just before Christmas, we start into a new reading. We have, there are 150 Psalms. They are not written all at the same time. They're not written by the same person. In fact, authorship of almost all of them is actually anonymous. There are some of them that are called Psalm of David, but it was a literary thing to do at the time, to write a psalm, which could be a variety of things. It could be a prayer. A psalm, some of these psalms were written as prayers, and they were prayed in the temple. They were prayed in gatherings to strengthen an individual's life of faith and also a community's life of faith. So they are prayers, they are songs. Some of them are literally the poetry that we don't know the music, how they were set at the time, but there was music that accompanied them. And so they were songs in that sense. And then some of them are just prose and poetry, reflecting on the relationship between human beings and God. And some of them are, all of them are very down to earth. They're very, I didn't want to say graphic, but if you follow along through with this, you'll see that part of the interest in praying the prayers and reciting the songs that they do was to give witness not just to their trust and their faith in God, but also to give witness to what it's like, the difficulty of enemies and the difficulty of frustration. And there are many psalms that I say are, shaking their fists at God. Excuse me for one moment. I have someone that's trying to join our online study and is looking for directions. Pardon me. I do on Tuesday evenings, I do a Bible study that is more interactive, and that's a Zoom class. And so the question that was asked me is, so why can't I see you? There's no Zoom invitation. I do this study this way because there are many of our congregation who are not technologically savvy, but they are subscribers to this YouTube channel, and so they are able, when it pops up, to click it and join in. But the YouTube or the Zoom concept is just too complicated. So I do both. I do the Bible study on Tuesday evening through Zoom class, and then this one through just a lecture style format where we are right now. So I want to read, I thought there's no point in trying to just say it. I just wanted to read what the commentary, the running commentary that is a part of, I read from the New Oxford Annotated Bible. It is what's called a study Bible, which means that the works of scholars are written along in the pages. There's a long introduction to the book of Psalms, explaining the various parts of it, how it was used, what are the best ideas about how to interpret it, given what we know about the times and the circumstances in which they were written. So I wanted to read for you this one paragraph that comes at the end of the scholars' comments on how best to interpret the Psalms. I'm going to read the first paragraph. For about 2,000 years, the 150 Psalms have been lovingly memorized as a prayer book, transposing to the daily life of Jewish and Christian people the meeting of Israel and its Lord. These psalms have been prayed from antiquity forward by the founders of the rabbinic Judaism, early Christians, the fathers and mothers of the church, and the medieval synagogue and church. They are today a treasure shared by Jews and Christians. The Psalms' power lies not only in being sacred scripture, but also in their reflecting of human feelings before God and expressing them directly, concretely, and skillfully. Despite the Psalms' splendor and humanity, people often find it difficult to pray them, for many of the Psalms seem violent and vindictive. We must remember, however, that the chief issue for biblical worshipers is God's power to save. Can God save from life's dangers and grant protection and prosperity? This is a question that's underlying in the Psalms. Since the arena in which power was displayed most vividly is in the battlefield, it is not surprising that the Lord, or God, was often portrayed as a warrior, ruling with power. The war imagery, however, is secondary to the main point. God is a just ruler, a just judge, who upholds the faithful and the righteous, and puts down the wicked and the rebellious. The so-called vindictive psalms are especially difficult for those who simplistically view Christianity as uniformly gentle and concerned primarily with the individual's soul. The psalmists think concretely rather than abstractly. They view evil as embodied in unjust people, and thus they pray for their elimination, including their potential for living on with their children. The Psalms generally entrust the carrying out of these wishes into God's hands, in the conviction that only God can make the world truly just and good. Sufferers can, however, cry out to God to take action, and can even use words that appear extreme. Those who trust in God can pray these psalms by leaving everything, execution and timetable, into God's hands. I want to read one sentence of that again. The psalmists think concretely rather than abstractly. They view evil as embodied in unjust people, and thus they pray for their elimination. So, let's begin with Psalm 1. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on God's law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by the streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked perish. So you hear already in this Psalm 1, you hear this it's either this or this. There is a sense in what the commentator said in the beginning. There's no cosmic world of evil for the writers of the Psalms. Evil exists in people, in human beings. And the only solution, at least in the graphic language of the Psalms, is the only solution to evil people is for them to be eliminated. And you know evil people because of what they do, how they treat others. And the people that are followers of God, they meditate on the law of God. The law of God is love. It's not unknown to them. The law of God is not, in the best sense of the Hebraic tradition, the law of God frees you to love and to be selfless. It's caring for the other. Jesus summarized all the law and the prophets by saying, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the law and the prophets all summed up. So, meditating on the law of God and then producing the fruit. Over my life, I have loved that, how many songs and hymns have picked up on this theme of, like a tree planted by the water. The righteous, if you will, sounds like an alien word for us, but by the righteous, they do not mean people who are better than other people. They mean people who live by the law of God. They seek God's forgiveness, and they live a life of humility. They bear fruit. It's like their lives are, the roots of their lives go down deeper than the superficiality of people who cheat and lie and steal and murder and do all the things that disrupt and destroy life. I'm checking to see if our friend got on. Yes. So this image of the righteous, which means the people who seek to walk with God, to live a life with God, to live a life of faith, they are like trees planted by the water. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this or not, but if you're in an area where there's a drought going on, sometimes you don't see the underground waterways, but you can always find them, because if you look across a kind of a dry, arid landscape and you see that there are one or two trees that have green leaves, you know their roots have gone down deep and they've tapped into the underground waterway. Or, when the river is flowing on the surface, the trees by the water have an endless supply of what they need. And trees grow because of water. And they grow roots that go deep, and they're strong. And then when the floods come, they stand up to the floods mostly. They keep the banks of the river in place. These are images of strength and solidity and character in life. The wicked are perceived as people who do not have roots. Their lives will be washed away. They will not stand. They will not be able to endure what comes along because they move to the rhythms of a different drummer. And Psalm 1 begins what is in some ways, the great divide. You trust in God or you don't. You live your life according to God's way or you don't. And in the Psalms and throughout the Psalms, you'll find that even though very graphically they'll describe that the wicked do prosper, sometimes the wicked do better, they have more money, or sometimes they have more power. But in the end, the invitation for those who have faith is to live by faith and to allow the knowledge that you have of God and of God's knowledge of you to give you the strength to endure. Because in the end, right, that the arc of history bends towards justice is a deep and abiding thought that underlies the Psalms. For those who trust in God, you can pray these Psalms by leaving everything about how to fix the world, how to make it more like what it needs to be in God's hands. And our role is then to trust. So let's read Psalm number 2, because in the linking, these two kind of go together, as I think you'll hear. One thing I wanted to point out is that the Psalms, they use a lot of first-person pronouns, but a lot of the Psalms are actually addressed to people, like they're groups of people. Individuality is often lost in the sense of this. This is about us as the people of faith who are like trees that produce fruit. I just wanted to say that. It'll come up again along the way. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us." The one who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possessions. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling. Kiss God's feet. For God will be angry, and you will perish in the way. For God's wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him." So this conversation, again, declares that God is in charge of the world. Kings come and go, rulers come and go, nations come and go. But the message to them is this one sentence, "I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." Some think this refers to King David, but it's more the sense of the ones that God has called and ordained to be the rulers of the world are this faithful people. And their rule is not like other nations that rule. They do not rule by military power or by conspiring together about how to take power for themselves. The Psalter and actually Hebrew theology and the prophets takes a position up as a critique of governments. And there are guides in terms of how to evaluate whether or not a particular king or a dynasty or an organization of a governmental authority is operating in sync with God. There are ways to know that bearing the fruits that God gives them. The warning in Psalm 2 is to world leaders, to governments that rise up in power to go, you begin to imagine that because you have power that you are in charge of the world, and you are not. And you will learn this. It may not happen today, but you will learn this. Be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling. Kiss his feet. I was looking to see if there was a better understanding of what that is about. Or God, that the real ruler of the universe, will be angry. And you will face the wrath of God. Happy are all who take refuge in God. The companionship between the Psalms and the prophets is a good read, and we'll get to the prophets when we get finished with the Psalms and the book of Solomon. But sometimes it's so close, it's implied, and then we don't hear it. There's no mystery in this thing of what God wants. There's no mystery in it. It gets confused along the way, but God, with the people of God, like us, people who want to be followers of God and walking with God in our lives, it's not our lot to then gain power. It's not, the power of this earth is usually collected by people who have evil intent. God's way is power through mercy, power through compassion, power through generosity, power through benevolence and giving to those who don't have, seeing what we do have as a gift, not earned by our power or because of the strength of our military strategy. I'm saying all this to say I think it's very important to put on the mindset of a biblical view of the role of governments. Now, these are attributed to King David in a time when the idea was that God was ruling on the earth, but ruling through an actual government, through a king, a theocracy. That David and Saul and Solomon had come to power because God had actually appointed them to be rulers and to be kings of the earth, and that God actually mediated what God wanted for the world and for especially the people of Abraham and Sarah, for their descendants, through the king. Now, I don't think it's just because I'm a child of the contemporary age, but I think that the Bible itself holds monarchy in some contempt. That as a model of government, the warning from Samuel the prophet was that if you have a king and an earthly dynasty develops, that there will only be two consequences to that. One is a king and a kingdom will raise taxes because kings are enormously greedy. And then the other thing is, in order to defend their way, they will have an army and they will multiply their power. So, as much as the Psalms celebrate the life of King David, the warnings that are woven in to the expression of faith in the Psalms are filled with the cautions that if you claim God is your power and God is your strength in your life, you need to look carefully at the description of what the Psalter says are the signs, are the fruits that you are actually working as an ambassador of God. You cannot be a government from God and then ignore the law of God. the law of love, the law of protection of the neighbor, the special care of orphans and widows, the special structures to care for sojourners, strangers, as they move through your land. These are so much a part of what was understood as what God wanted that sometimes in the Psalter they just simply, they don't break it down. They say, well, follow the law of God. Well, what is the law of God? The law of God is justice and mercy. It is justice. It's seeking God's view, not our own view, and it has a tendency to decry power, to say, a lot of human beings, when they get power, it becomes power over others, and that immediately begins to corrupt people in terms of how they're going to share their power and how they're going to exercise their power. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord. Serve the Lord with trembling. Kiss God's feet, or God will be angry. The nation that rules in autocracy apart from God's way, the prophets come along and they, there's a great big theological question that happens in the life of this people. Their story started with Abram and Sarah and a big dynasty of a big family that then ended up in Egypt because of a famine, and then fell into some sort of life of subserviency in the city. And then they were delivered by Moses. They were brought out of the captivity that they were living in, whatever the nature of that was. And then they went into the wilderness to a place of deep soul searching as individuals, in some ways to get a master's degree, if you will, on this thing of walking with God. How are we to live this life of faith? We live it by faith. We have to trust in God for tomorrow. We have to hope in God's work for our failures of yesterday. And this fine-tuning, the developing of faith, trust. You can't live in this world if you can't trust. And so, what's a great place to teach trust? Well, a great place to teach trust is in the middle of the wilderness, where most of what you would depend upon yourself is gone. So they have this history of having wandered in the wilderness and then waiting for an arrival of a day when they could live out their life and live out their mission from God, to be a blessing to the families of the earth. That's what it says back in the book of Genesis to Abram and Sarah. God, in spite of all the ways that God is often characterized as this maniacal, evil being who's angry, God's anger is in relationship to the unfulfillment or the lack of fulfillment of God's mission of love and mercy and grace in the world. The nations get power, according to the psalmist, in order to carry out God's plan for mercy and grace in the world. That's what it's about. And the warning is, don't take that lightly. Don't think for a moment that you can abuse the poor, or that you can somehow neglect the widows and take their fortunes through changes of laws, or to discard the orphans as if they're not important because they don't have mothers and fathers on the earth. To treat the strangers as if no one cares about them because God cares about the strangers. These foundational ideas about the God of the Bible, you have to bring them with you into the reading of the Psalms. O kings, be wise. A government will not stand. It will not stand if it neglects the concerns and the priorities of the one who governs the world. It's just built right into the fabric of the believer's understanding. So in this case, what happens is, in the ongoing story, that They arrive in the promised land. They have a land flowing with milk and honey. I've shared with you, in spite of the fact that they do a lot of retelling of the story, I think there's plenty of evidence that says that when they arrived back in what was the land of their ancestors, they found that it was pretty much deserted. Swarms of locusts and hornets had made the land uninhabitable. And so when they came back into the land, it was a gift from God. It was a land rich, and they were people without a place to be. And so they came together and they divided up the land, and the idea was they were going to begin to live out this mission. And they were going to be a place when, if you were a traveler and you traveled through, you'd be amazed because the scales in the marketplace were going to be just. They were going to be fair. The rates of conversion from one currency to another would be honest. There would be hospitality and generosity. There would be love practiced even to strangers. It would be a safe place for vulnerable people to live. People who became sick would be cared for. Why? All of it because everything we have received as a gift from God, who blesses us so that we can bless the world. I feel like I can't say that enough as a foundation for understanding what is the frame of mind of the people who wrote these Psalms. This is the great longing of God in the world, is to have a government of justice and love and grace. So, be wise. What happens is that the community of people, we didn't get to that part yet because we just came through Job, but what takes place is an amazing thing because they move into the settlement land, they divide up the land, and they begin living, and then problems arise, conflicts between them, and then also border and boundary problems of nations that are around them. They get invaded a lot, and their food storage gets taken, and they want a defense system. And so it's a kind of a militia plan in the beginning, and that is that when needed, we'll rally an army and we'll defend ourselves, and then the people become really unhappy, and they decide that they need more earthly structure to their government. They need more government. And so they elect a king. And they're warned, this structure of this government will be great in one way because it will give you the confidence on earth that there is someone there watching out for you, but in the end, that someone, that structure, that governmental organization will fail and begin to care only for itself. And they will raise armies and they will raise taxes, and so of course Saul becomes a king, David becomes a king, Solomon becomes a king, and then there's the end to what is the consistent dynasty because civil war breaks out. Among this people that are supposed to be a blessing to the families of the earth, they can't even figure out how to live together with each other. And the whole rest of the history, all the way through, leading up to the place where we are in the Bible, where we have the Psalms, is a story of a people who didn't seem to learn one lesson in the wilderness. The prophets come along and they say, you have to understand your whole nation fell apart. They were invaded, they were carried away. The whole project is just decimated. The temple is torn down. The people are in despair. They see the collapse entirely of the whole idea of a people of God living on the earth to be a blessing to the families of the earth. It fails. It just fails miserably. And the prophets, which we'll get to next, say, people ask, why did this happen to us? Why did this happen? And the answer from the prophets is, well, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, serve the Lord with fear, with trembling, kiss his feet, or you will be angry and you will perish in the way. His wrath is quickly kindled. The prophets say, what did you expect? You built a wealthy dynasty. You built armies that went out and conquered people in war. These are not the signs of a people of God. They're just not. I'm going to read one more psalm for today, since we're underway. Psalm 3 is attributed as a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Now, that's why I laid the background a little bit, because once the kingdom idea came about, once they thought that a king, an earthly king, would be better than an untouchable heavenly monarch, it was pretty much a disaster. Like Solomon, David has his own failures, but in the end, a conflict of civil war breaks out. And David is so far now stirred up by his own actions, a revolution is taking place in his own kingdom. The people are rebelling against David. And the leader of the revolution is David's son. That's how far the brokenness extends to this new idea of a monarchy. David's son now takes up weapons against him. And so he's running from his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and you answer me from your holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Rise up, O Lord. Deliver me, O my God. For you strike all enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people. So here is part of the tone of what develops for many of the Psalms. In this one, a Psalm of David, there's an imagination of David. I don't know, he says, like, life has this way, right? It turns against you. David was living his life, and now all of a sudden his own son is leading a rebellion against him. You ask, how can it be this bad? It wasn't a small uprising. It threatened David's life, his dynasty. His son was absolutely convinced that his father, David, had become a terrible person and no longer deserved to rule. David then cries out to God. I think there's this dynamic that is in the Psalms, which I'm not really all that familiar with. I'm trying to exercise it in my own life. But there is a calling out to God as if you've got to awaken God to what's going on. Rise up, O Lord, and deliver me. It's as if God is watching and listening, but David is saying, hey, do you see what's going on down here? I'm trusting you. I know you can deliver. I know you can strike the foe and win the fight and be the conqueror. I know that you can do that. But, it might be time for you to do that for me. It might be time for you to deliver me. He says he's not afraid. Maybe he's not afraid, but he also knows the real risk. He knows the risk of where he's at. He is in a very, very dangerous place. And one of the questions, again, that kind of circles around all of this for those of us who are contemporary readers is, what is it? What's happening to this King David, the mighty King David, right? The one who God's heart is after. What's happening that his kingdom of all kingdoms is just collapsing? David does not have a good record as a king in the long run. He's revered looking back, and Christians especially celebrate the fact that Jesus was born in the line of David. But if you do a study of David, of the actual king and the monarchy that was the Davidic kingdom, one of the signs of God's blessings was longevity in a monarchy. That rulers in the same line would come along, and if that's the case, there's something very wrong in the line of David, because David's son Solomon becomes the king, and that's the end of the unified kingdom. It's the end of the dynasty of David. So there are other kings who say they are in the line of David, but here it is right at the very heart. Absalom, David's son, is leading a rebellion against him. I lie down calmly. Calmly sleeping while enemies lurk is an act of trust. So David trusts that he's still in the Lord's favor, but he's waiting for God to move and to punish those who seem intent on his destruction, including his son. I think I'm going to stop there for today. I know it's only it's less than an hour today, but I'm going to stop. I don't want to rush through these. I still have to figure out what the format will be for us as I read and discuss these, because they're short, most of them. I mean, Psalm 121 is very long, but many of them are very short, and I don't want to shortchange them, move on with too many topics for you to think about. I'd rather just continue to allow you to savor them. So I'm going to encourage you to go back, reread them, think a little bit more about what I've said about them, and then we'll come back next week. It'll be after Christmas, and we can start out our in-between before the new year, but then also start this whole year reading 150 Psalms. And I encourage you to go and read ahead. And especially if you have a study Bible, read the footnotes that are at the bottom, because it will help you so much to understand, what's happening. And hopefully I can bring to you some insights along the way as well. All right, my friends, I thank you for being here today. I know we missed last week and I think even the week before, so I'm glad to be back in this routine of this class. I will be here every Wednesday, continuing through into the new year, if God is willing and continues to give us the blessings to be able to do it. Thank you for being present today for this study, and I will wait to talk some more with you about this 1 week from today on Wednesday. Merry Christmas to you, and I hope that the holiday comes, but that you're being safe and that we can hold on in faith, knowing that God is with us. God bless you, my friends. I'll talk to you next week.